Welcome to Crimson Clues, where shadows hide secrets and silence reveals the truth. Every story is a puzzle, and every clue takes you closer to the answer. Subscribe now, join the hunt, and let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. A Death in the Snow. It is one of the peculiarities of my friendship with Hercule Poirot that peace and quiet rarely last long. The man has a genius, to be sure, of that no one doubts. But with genius, as I've often found, comes a certain magnetic attraction for trouble. Even when we intend nothing more than a quiet holiday, fate has a way of intervening. In December of 1925, Poirot declared that he had been overexerting the little grey cells and must absolutely take a rest. A man must not be a slave to brilliance, Hastings, he said solemnly, folding his napkin after breakfast one cold London morning. Even I must retreat sometimes into comfort and calm. As luck would have it, a letter arrived that very afternoon from Monsieur Giraud, a retired magistrate and an old acquaintance of Poirot from his early days in France. Giraud had recently taken up residence in the village of Saint-Fort, a sleepy corner of Dordogne, and suggested that Poirot join him for Christmas and New Year's. The air was bracing, he said, the food excellent, the wine even better, and the pace of life slow. Perhaps at last slow enough to soothe even the great detective's nerves. Charming, I said when Poirot handed me the letter. You could do with a bit of quiet exactment. And so we departed England a few days before Christmas, taking the boat train to Paris, and from there journeying south by railway through the Lire Valley and into the gentle hills of the Périgord. As we travelled, the scenery changed from grey to white, frost-tipped trees, snow-covered fields, and slate roofs dusted with powder. I had never been to Whodunit in winter, and found the stillness of it curiously beautiful. Upon arriving in Saint-Fort, little more than a huddle of stone houses, really, we were met by Giraud himself, bundled in a scarf and great coat. He welcomed us warmly and drove us in his motor car to the inn, where rooms had been prepared for us. The village, he explained, lay in the shadow of the Château Murder, a grand estate just beyond the woods owned by Monsieur Etienne Verret, a local landowner and minor nobleman. I know the family well, Gerard said. Their old stock, though their fortune, has dwindled. Etienne is a proud man and stubborn like his late father, but his wife, Lod, she's something else. Cool as glass, that one. His tone was neutral, but not without edge. I noted it and filed it away. We spent the first 2 days strolling the countryside, playing cards by the fire, and sampling the local delicacies, of which there were many. Poirot, to my surprise, seemed almost content. There is balance here, Hastings, he said as we sipped. Vanchot in the tavern, the symmetry of the vineyards, the stillness of the snow, even the cows, they are orderly sere. Naturally, that was the precise moment when everything changed. On the morning of the third day, as the snow outside lay undisturbed and crystalline upon the village rooftops, a sharp knock came at our door, urgent, insistent, and entirely out of harmony with the calm that had reigned thus far. Poirot and I exchanged a glance. He was just smoothing the cuffs of his dressing gown, while I had been contentedly reading the local paper by the fire. It was early still, and we had not expected company. I rose to answer it, and there stood Giraud, hat in hand, his overcoat dusted with frost, and his complexion several shades paler than it had been the evening before. Though he was a man generally possessed of calm judicial reserve, this morning he wore the unmistakable mask of agitation. "I beg your pardon for the intrusion," he said in a low voice, stepping inside as I ushered him from the cold, "but there has been a development of some gravity." Poirot, who had already risen to his feet, narrowed his eyes with sudden intensity. "A development, you say? Do not keep us in suspense, Monu. Has there been a crime?" Giraud hesitated, pressing his lips into a thin line. "Worse, I fear. A death." The air in the room seemed to constrict at once. Poirot's expression shifted subtly, from interest to concern, and then to that unmistakable sharpness which always marked the beginning of a case. With no further prompting, I rang for coffee and we bade Giraud sit. He remained standing. "It is Etienne Verne," he said finally, "the master of the chateau. He died in the early hours of the morning, quite suddenly, quite violently." Poirot tilted his head. "Mondour, an accident?" The attending physician does not believe so. The symptoms, he says, suggest something far more sinister. Vomiting, seizures, labored breathing. He suspects poisoning. Poirot's brow furrowed. And the local authorities? I called the inspector myself, Giraud replied grimly. But as I feared, his attentions have already fixed themselves upon Madame Hulot. I must confess I started at that. His own wife. That's rather a bold conclusion. It is, Gérard admitted, and perhaps premature, but you know as well as I do how easily the spectre of inheritance clouds judgment, particularly in provincial minds already prone to suspicion. I have known the Verret family for many years, and though I cannot say with certainty what lies beneath the surface, I do know this. When money, property, and blood are entwined, the truth is rarely simple. Poirot's eyes glittered with interest. Now, and he motioned for Giraud to continue, Etienne inherited the château in full after the death of his father. Giraud went on. The land, the vineyards, the title, all passed directly to him. His sister, Mademoiselle Marie Verne, was left with a modest stipend and little else. The widow, Élodie, of course, stood to gain everything upon his death. The estate under local law will now pass into her hands, unless, of course, a criminal charge intervenes. There was a long silence. And what of the circumstances of this alleged poisoning? Poirot asked finally. An almond cake, apparently, prepared by Élodie herself the previous evening, a family recipe. Only Etienne ate of it. The others declined. He was taken ill not long after supper and never recovered. The staff are already whispering, and the inspector is only too eager to believe them. I gave a low whistle. That's rather damning. Poirot raised a finger. No, Hastings, it is not damning, it is convenient, too convenient perhaps. Almonds, after all, are the scent most notoriously associated with cyanide. It is the first thing even the most unimaginative constable would notice. He turned to Gérard. My friend, you have done well to come to me. I do not like coincidences. They are the laziest of lies. He stood, brushing an invisible fleck from his sleeve. It seems, Hastings, that our restful holiday has taken on a rather different character. The chateau awaits, and I believe Madame Élodie Verne will soon require the services of Hercule Poirot. Chapter 2. Élodie, the Widow. Like something torn from the pages of a Gothic book, the Château Verret appeared through the fog. Its towers bowed. With age, its ivy-clad walls dark against the blanket of snow. The house loomed silently and statuesquely ahead of us as our motorcycle crunched up the long gravel drive. The great fir trees that lined the path cast longueuil shadows across the grounds. Mademoiselle Marie Verne, the late Monsieur's sister, a tall, sallow-faced woman with sharp cheekbones and the air of one who had been consistently let down by life, greeted us at the door rather than a servant. The harshness of her black gloves and the funereal pin at her collar already reflected her mourning dress, though it was not yet complete. "You are the detective?" she inquired, her suspicious gaze flitting to Poirot. Poirot bowed his head politely and precisely. "Earl Poe at your service, and this is my friend and associate, Captain Hastings." She gave us a small nod but no hand, and moved aside to let us in. The entrance hall was wide, stone-flagged and gently echoing. A painting of a stern man with the distinctive eyes of Etienne Vere hung above a chilly, empty fireplace on the far wall. The smell of old wax and old secrets permeated everything. As Marie guided us across the gallery, her heels clicking on the glossy floor, she added, "I assume you're here at Miss Giraud's request." It was inevitable, I guess, that outside intervention would be introduced. "Madam, I'm just here to watch, and maybe to see what others have missed," Poirot remarked softly. The widow was waiting for us in the little salon, a tasteful space of dark wood and brocade. As we walked in, Madame Élodie Verret emerged from a settee, calm but gaunt. She was striking. She wasn't gorgeous in the traditional sense, but she was stylish in that effortless way that seems to come naturally to French women. At the nape of her neck, her dark hair was curled. Behind the sadness, there was a quiet intellect in her storm-grey eyes. "They tell me you have come to ask questions," she remarked quietly. "If you are willing, madam." She motioned for us to take a seat. I kept a tight eye on her, anticipating a sign of anxiety, a hand tremor, or a look of defiance. However, she calmly and resolutely endured our scrutiny. Not suspected of murder, she poured tea as though entertaining visitors. At that moment, the big wooden door creaked open again, and a burly man in a threadbare costume strode in, his face flushed with the enthusiasm of his work and the cold. The local magistrate, Inspector Duval, had shown up with a mix of formality and obvious irritation. After giving Poirot a curtain nod, he immediately began a report in a lively and enthusiastic tone. "The evidence is unmistakable, Monsieur Poirot. Poisoning. The most likely suspect is Madame Elod. Justice must be served quickly, since the family is restless." Poirot, however, countered his zeal with cool poise, stating gently, "Inspector, justice requires patience and truth requires proof." As the tension in the room increased, Duval stood rigidly by the window, his glare flickering for a moment before he said another word. She started, "My husband," and went to bed at 9 o'clock. After dinner he had complained of some discomfort and a headache. His sobbing woke me up at midnight. He was hurting. I immediately called the doctor, but she took a brief breath before he could get there. It was too late. Poirot leaned a little forward. "What about the dinner? A cake was reportedly supplied." "No, I did make it myself, yes. Almond cake with a gâteau d'amande." Etienne enjoyed it. Her eyes remained fixed. However, the idea that I would poison my own husband with a cake that I served him in front of the entire family is ridiculous. The room was occupied by 4 individuals. Only one person did, though, he demanded. The others had already eaten. He was late returning from town. Who else was there, may I ask? The dish was brought in by the cook, Madame Jave, our housekeeper, and my sister-in-law, Marie. Everyone will attest to what I said. Poirot nodded slightly. "Forgive the question, madam, but had your husband enemies? Any recent quarrels, financial distress, perhaps?" Something flashed across her face, perhaps reluctance or distaste. "Miss Poirot, he was not a man accustomed to tranquility. Despite his pride, conceit, and tendency toward cruelty, my husband maintained order in his affairs, or so he claimed. As for adversaries, if there are any, they do not reside under this roof." A brittle hush fell. She folded her hands in her lap, one thumb unconsciously circling the other. "Finally, you must understand," she murmured. "Between us there was no love lost. It was expected of me to marry Etienne. I needed security, and he needed a wife. Such marriages are formed in this way." She spoke simply and without sentimentality, or shame, stating the facts. Compared to if she had cried, it was more unsettling. Slowly, Poirot nodded. "Nevertheless, you are the one who gets everything." Elod did not flinch, he just stared. "Yes, by his will the shadow and estate passed to me, as is customary," I said, in a barely discernible whisper below my breath. "That does make things very convenient." She gave me a quick flip of her gaze. "Do you think I had a hand in my husband's death, Captain Hastings?" I felt immediately uncomfortable and cleared my throat. "Madame, I don't tend to make snap judgments. I'm not here to make accusations. I'm here to listen and learn." She gave me a steady look and then answered, "For most, that's all I have to say." The cold in the hallway seemed to get worse as we got up to leave the salon, the dreary winter light creating long, gloomy shadows. Inspector Duval stayed close behind us, his eyes alert and agitated, showing his desire to get the problem resolved as quickly as possible. As if buried in contemplation, Poirot stopped next to a faded tapestry and ran a finger lightly over its tattered threads. "Well, Hastings," he responded, "tell me, what do you see?" I turned to look at the room where Madame Elod was still, standing, her poise unflinching. I added softly, "She's clever, controlled, and emotionless. I don't think she will ever confess if she is guilty." "Ah, but confession is not always needed. There are numerous paths to truth, some lined with reason and others with pride. Why poison? To prevent blood. Too clean a death for a passion-driven crime." Poirot gave a small smile. "Indeed, but it's a woman's approach as well, discreet, intimate, and constantly nearby." Duval gave a snort. "The signs are evident, and the victim's own wife is the obvious suspect. Psychology and riddles are unnecessary." Poirot regarded the inspector calmly, not impressed by his directness. "Justice demands patience, not hurry, Massy Duval. Truth is more nuanced than a single charge. Bristling, Duval folded his arms and was silent for a bit before continuing. I shall not allow the truth elude me if it is concealed by nuances and vanity. But I promise you that the law will apprehend her. Poirot's eyes glowed a little. Maybe, but we need to talk to other members of the home before passing judgment. Everybody might be carrying a piece of this puzzle. Duval's expression tensed. Additional interviews. Excellent, but there isn't much time. Between the two males, I glanced. Inspector, we'll get started right now. Every witness may put light on this sordid event. Poirot nodded his head in conformity. Indeed, Hastings. The Château itself keeps its secrets to itself as the jigsaw starts to come together. I experienced a growing sense of unease as we ventured farther into the center of the Verete estate. Long hours of interrogation and possibly the first real glimpses of the truth were what the day held. Chapter 3. Will of the Dead Man. As we started, the process of interviewing those who had known Etienne Verete the best in his last days, the chateau appeared to be enveloped in quiet. I could feel Poirot's keen intellect eagerly piecing together every detail as the atmosphere was heavy with unsaid grudges and shaky friendships. We were escorted by Inspector Duval. He strode forward fast and grim, as though he could push the facts out into the open with pure force. I had a suspicion that he thought Poirot's tactics were too tactful by half, and I was certain that he felt the same way. The family physician, Monsieur Besson, was the subject of our first interview. He was a quiet guy whose kind demeanor did little to conceal the severity of his fears. We discovered him in a tiny room surrounded by delicate lavender, scents and medical literature. The afternoon glare made the panes tremble. Poirot said, Dr. Besson, with a courteous air of seriousness, "You were present when Miss Yverne passed away? Please let us know how you felt about his health in the days leading up to his passing." The doctor's attitude was solemn as he adjusted his glasses. Etienne was a reasonably active man who occasionally became irritable. I ascribed his recent complaints of headaches and sporadic lightheadedness to stress. At the moment, nothing indicated that the end was imminent. Duval bent over. Were there any particular symptoms he mentioned? Is there anything that could indicate poisoning? Bison's forehead wrinkled. Just nebulous problems, exhaustion and stomach issues. I suspected food poisoning when I was called that evening, but the severity and speed of the illness were concerning. Not common. Poirot softly tapped the desk with a finger. So even then you suspected foul play? Yes, in silence, I thought about it. Although there was no known poison, the symptoms were sudden and severe. Suspicion is not evidence on its own. However, sometimes a thing's shadow might reveal more about it than its actual presence, Poirot remarked quietly. Duval let out a tiny, impatient sigh. No conclusive evidence has been found at the post-mortem. We currently have only conjecture and no hard evidence. Besson paused. Maybe. But there's another thing. Etienne recently expressed to me ambiguous, hard-to-define concerns. He talked about invisible dangers, treachery, and a feeling that someone close to him was out to get him. Poirot's eyes became piercing. Was there anyone he specifically mentioned? No, yet despite his severity, he was not a fantasy man. I think his dread of betrayal was grounded, in fact. He had become weary and suspicious. Duval's arms were folded. Couldn't aging, deteriorating health, or anxiety account for that? Besson looked up at him, his eyes level. Maybe it was the late-onset kind of lucidity. I noticed a subtle change in Poirot's face, the kind that occurs when a component finds its home. Doctor, did you give him any medicine the night before he died? He asked. Not by me. The week prior I had supplied mild and accounted for sleeping pills. He was particular about who handled his meds. It was typically taken with meals or made by the kitchen. Poirot gave a nod. So the possibility for mischief would reside with those in the family. Or, Duval blurted, the kitchen. Next I'll ask the employees. Poirot disregarded him. Doctor, tell me, was Madame Elod there when you got there? Slowly, Besson said, She was, remarkably composed. She didn't cry. She remained calm. However, not everyone expresses pain in the same manner. The doctor looked toward the darkening windows as we got up to go. Gervais was a man who surrounded himself with walls. I worry that they ultimately excluded both assistance and harm. Duval remained silent as he made his way back through the lengthy hallways, but I could see that he was frowning. He did not enjoy being reminded of the intangible, but Poirot appeared to be much more content. He said, "You noticed that, Hastings? The doctor's hesitation. A cautious choice of words. Something is beginning to glimmer. You think he knows more than he says?" "I believe he's seen something," Poirot remarked. "It's a different story, whether he understands what he's seen." Marie. Fern was standing near the large windows of the Shadows library, her hands clasped peacefully in front of her, her posture perfectly straight. Her face was one of reserved authority, not that of a weeping sister, but that of a governess in charge of a home. Inspector Duval was already in the room, his attitude crisp with formal, his notebook in hand. As we joined him, he nodded curtly, and I got the impression that he had not made much progress with Marie. With careful courtesy, Poirot introduced herself as Madame Verete. "Thank you for your time. It is vital for us to grasp the mood here in the days up to your brother's passing." She cocked her head. "Of course, it is only proper that the truth be pursued." "Tell us then about your relationship with Etienne," I asked. Marie had a firm, almost formal voice. "We were siblings, not bonded by love but by blood and obligation. Etienne had high standards and a strong will. Our conflicts were well known, and he ruled this farm with a hard fist." Poirot applied light pressure. "And the actual home? Were there conflicts among the residents?" Marie looked at the window for a moment, then back at us. "All families have tension, particularly when money and property are involved. Although I refrain from passing judgment on private affairs, it is no secret that Madame Elod's entrance brought about a change in the equilibrium of the home." The page was scraped hastily by Duval's pen. "Do you mean that they didn't like her?" Marie smiled slightly but subtly. "Let's claim she wasn't hugged, Inspector. Before he passed away, was your brother particularly troubled by anything? Are there anti-conflicts?" Marie's eyes grew piercing. Etienne kept his cards close to the vest. He didn't tell me if there were any problems. Poirot bowed his head. "As well as the will, lady. It is known that Madame Elod was given complete control of the estate." Marie narrowed her brows and nodded briefly, almost reluctantly. "Indeed. My brother's final will leaves everything to Elod. If I claimed it sat well with me, I would be lying." Her tone was piercing, with a hint of resentment at Elo's abrupt rise. "To me, Elodie has always been little more than a stranger, an outsider married in for convenience rather than devotion. It is a tough pill to chew to see her established as the chateau's only mistress." Poirot's eyes remained fixed, and I could see that he was silently observing Marie's every move. "Since her marriage, I've had some time to get to know the people who run the estate," Marie replied gently. "Among them is the steward, Richauve. There are hints that their relationship may have been a little closer than one might have thought, although nothing is publicly stated." The connotation was still evident even though her voice grew softer. "A woman who has a lot to inherit, and a man who is well positioned in the home. If one were to explore alternative intentions, such a link might raise problems." Duval's brows lifted. "Are you proposing an impropriety?" "I don't have any suggestions," she said calmly. "However, I have seen how comfortable they are with each other and how often they converse. Things like this are noticed in a home like this." Then, with her body tense, she turned aside, perhaps daring us to challenge her. After thanking her, we left. Until we were halfway down the hallway, Duval remained silent. "She is resentful," he whispered. "Jealousy, maybe these Charvet rumors, nothing concrete." Poirot's eyebrows went up. "Duval, no. However, sometimes there is a kernel of truth behind the bitterness, and the deeper current is revealed by what one chooses to say rather than what one says." I looked back toward the library doors as we came down the grand staircase. Marie Verret was standing just as she had been, completely alone and still upright. Chapter 4. The story becomes more complex. Madame Jave was in the large kitchen of the Château, a space filled with the aroma of herbs and the last of the hearth's embers. The cook was a robust, middle-aged woman with a carefully pinned white cap framing her face and hands, still covered in flowers. She gave us a tired look, as though she was used to keeping the Château's secrets as zealously as its cutlery. Poirot said softly, "Madame Jaryu made the dinner the night Miss Yver became ill." She folded her big fists in front of her and nodded. "Yes, I do recall it clearly, monsieur. In order to serve Miss Yver an almond cake after dinner, Madame Elodie requested a gate diamond. That night, did you see anything out of the ordinary in the kitchen? Is there anything missing?" The cook gave a hard shake of her head. "Monsieur, no. Everything was made as usual, and the ingredients were fresh. In my kitchen, I would never let anything go wrong." "Did Madame Elod see the preparation of the cake?" Under her supervision, she tasted the batter and gave me advice on how to use the almond essence. She was quite picky. "Who else consumed the cake?" After a moment of hesitation, Madame Jarre answered, "Only Ms. Yverne. Everyone else in the house had dined earlier." Despite my cautions about his stomach issues, he insisted on having a slice of the cake when he joined us for the postponed dinner. Alerts. The cook's worried gaze wavered. Throughout the evening, Mou had been complaining of stomach issues. Madame Hulot was adamant when I suggested that it might be best not to offer him the cake. Duval drew something hastily. "You mean she demanded?" A tight line formed in the cook's mouth. She claimed that it was customary and that it would lift his spirits. I cautioned both of them. Still, he ate it. Poirot's eyes became piercing. Were there any arguments or conflicts in the home that night? Madame Jarre's gaze lowered for a time. "There are always tensions. There is more stillness than talk in this house." "No, but that night I couldn't think of anything." However, she paused, but Duval gave a forceful prod. It was just before dinner time. "In the herb garden I caught Madame Elod talking to Miss Charvet. Quiet, close. They were familiar, but I had no right to listen." Duval let out a frustrated sound. More rumors like this. Poirot, though, only bowed his head. "Madame Jarret, thank you. Thank you for your candor." I could not help but notice the little shake in the cook's hands as we left the kitchen. I couldn't tell if it was fear or something else, but Poirot's eyes could not be read. Claudine, the housekeeper, was waiting for us in the servants' wing for our next interview. An angular, tall woman with a wrinkled face, she was a no-nonsense heir who had managed families for longer than some people had lived. Her approach exuded a quiet authority that comes from years of observing, listening, and saying very little. Poirot bowed his head courteously. "You have been with the Verne family for a long time, Madame Claudine. I would like to know how things were in the home in the weeks leading up to Monsieur Verne's passing." Her hands were clasped in her lap. Despite his difficulties, Monsieur Etienne maintained order. "Things have changed since Madame Elodie came. She brought with her a different air, silent but alert. Some have not been used to her." Perhaps as a hint that something in her tone had captured his attention, I noticed Poirot's brows lift a little. "Were there any specific conflicts?" She paused. The relationship between Mademoiselle Marie and Madame Elod was strained. The two were not on the same page. They probably won't. In a tight tone, Duval interrupted. "Madame, what kind of strains, disputes and charges?" She cautiously said, "No open quarrels, Inspector, but rather the type of coldness that says 1,000 words without using words." "Additionally," Mio Charvet Poirot inquired gently. "The steward?" Claudine's face became icy. "The estate cannot function without André. He is familiar with the books, the land, and the tenants. The place would falter without him." She hesitated, picking her words carefully. "Madame Elod and he are now acquainted. Some may say it's too familiar." I looked at Poirot, but he had his hands folded neatly and was observing Claudine. "What kind of familiarity?" he inquired gently. "When they believe no one is looking. They exchange glances and have discussions behind closed doors. Maybe it's nothing," she hurriedly added, "but in a house like this, whispers travel fast." Poirot nodded slightly. "Additionally, you didn't notice anything amiss on the night of Monsieur Verne's illness?" Claudine gave a headshake. "No, just that Monsieur seemed more agitated than normal at dinner. He appeared to be uncomfortable. In contrast, Madame Elodie stayed completely composed. She was too disciplined to express it directly, but there was a hint of suspicion in her voice. Duval snapped his notebook shut. "Madam, thank you. You'll let us know if you think of anything else, no matter how insignificant." She gave a rigid nod. The inspector stood, of course. "I'm grateful, Madame Claudine. You've been really beneficial." As we moved into the corridor, I murmured under my breath, "There's something between LOD and this Charvet fellow, you heard it." Poirot smiled quietly. "Ah, Hastings, I heard the suggestion. We need to untangle that, regardless of whether it's opportunity, manipulation, or affection." Duval glanced back. "And if it is opportunity," he remarked coolly, "we may already be looking at motive." I noticed a flicker of agreement in Poirot's eyes, but his face remained unchanged. Seated behind a desk, surrounded by folded maps of the grounds and ledgers, Richard was waiting for us in the estate office. The sun had set outside the small window, and the shadows of the chateau were long and slanted across the grass. As we walked in, he stood up, his calm face hiding sharp eyes. Poirot said, "Monsieur Charvet," without introducing himself. "A short issue, if you'll allow us. You weren't at dinner last night, and nobody at the table brought you up." "That is correct." Shave answered evenly. "I ate by myself. I didn't want to spend the night with the family." Poirot remarked, "You were missed," in a casual tone, "and yet it appears you were not wholly absent." Shave just blinked once. Poirot went on, "You were spotted with Madame Elode in the herb garden. Prior to the meal, there was a little respite, but it lasted." "Yes," Shave finally said. "We talked about the rosemary beds for a little while. The wild sorrel has taken over. She is interested in the garden. And when I proposed that we bring in the Duval gardener, she moved unimpressed next to me. A very casual explanation, that. Madame Jarre characterized your demeanor as familiar, rather than merely formal, as though, to soften Duval's bluntness, Poirot held up a gentle hand. Despite their value, Madame Jarre's observations need to be carefully considered. But would you say that you and Madame Elode were more than steward and mistress, Mr. Charavet's jaw clenched. "I was given the responsibility of overseeing a sizable and elderly estate. I worked closely with her, of course. It speaks more about them than it does about us if others thought that was inappropriate." "And did he know you were cooperating, Missy Verne?" Charvet took a moment to respond. When he did, his tone was purposeful. "Etienne mistrusted everyone. Yes, I think he resented my influence with Madame, but he did not keep any secrets." Poirot put a gloved fingertip to the edge of the desk and tapped. "And last night, after your chat in the garden, you spotted her again?" "No," Char said. "I retired after going to my quarters and going over the harvest accounts. That put a stop to it." Poirot's head cocked. "I also avoided the main house this morning. Until I was called, I was unaware of Etienne's condition. It's too late to help." Duval shot a peek at Poirot. "So you expect us to think you had no incentive or opportunity to interfere?" Shave's face became stern. "I expect you to study my remarks carefully." Silence fell. Poirot almost gave a nod of assent. Then, in a tone so casual it could have been an afterthought, he asked, "Do you frequently keep an eye on the kitchen garden at night?" Henry's gaze shifted to the sky. "When required." Poirot gave a small smile. When needed." We left. The weight of Poirot's thoughts was bearing down on us as soon as we entered the corridor. "Well," I said. Poirot repositioned his handcuffs. "Ah, Hastings. When a man lies, it is often not what he hides that reveals him, but how neatly he pretends. Nothing ever needed hiding." He hesitated. "The narrative of Monsieur Charvet is neat. Too neat." Duval agreed with a groan. "I'm prepared to delve farther." With that, he continued walking, his cane tapping softly, the only sound in the stone hall like a clock ticking away to revelation. Chapter 5. Time is of the essence. Poirot paced the floor with the restless energy of a trapped cat back in the tranquility of our inn-rooms where a roaring fire kept the December chill at bay. As I observed them both, a flurry of accusations and whispers swirling in my mind, Inspector Duval stood by the mantelpiece, looking stern and angry. With a firm "The case is clear," Duval broke the hush. Ellard, the wife, was eligible to receive a fortune. In addition to having an affair with the steward Shah, she was in a loveless marriage. All the witnesses attest to it. She made the cake. The man passed away after she served the cake. Opportunity, means, and motivation. Monsieur Poirot, it's a straight line. With a gleam in his eye, Poirot turned and halted his pacing. Inspector, a straight line is frequently the most misleading. 1. Is deterred from searching for the exquisite curve because it is so clear and straightforward. You have an excellent story. However, it contains a catastrophic fault. Duval's arms were folded. What may that be? Mon ami, the timing. Poirot tapped a finger in the air to emphasize his point that the timing was completely off. Think about your own witness's testimony. Claudine, the housekeeper, and Madame Jarre, the cook. Both of them are really obvious. Before dinner, Monsieur Vert was already feeling ill. He was uncomfortable and irritable. For that precise reason, Madame Jarre, specifically, told him not to consume the rich cake. He ate it and then passed away, but I sat forward. After being gently corrected, a prey, Hastings, was not a cause. The doctor tells us that the final manifestation was quick and forceful, but not due of the toxin. But even before he touched the cake with the fork, the symptoms were starting to appear. My friend, the cake serves as a diversion, a crude theatrical device intended to draw our focus to Madame Elode and her lover. He clicked resolutely and put the ornament down. We need to ask ourselves a different question. If a man is already experiencing the consequences of poison before he even eats his supper, what had he eaten the previous hour? Its logic was indisputable. For the first time, Duval's assured stance wavered, a glimmer of uncertainty appearing on his features. My own recent certainty about EOD and Shah started to waver, giving way to the well-known sense of respect for Poirot's unwavering capacity to see beyond the obvious. I whispered his evening ritual. We need to know the specifics of his routine, and we need the one person who would know it best for that. The following morning we returned to the chateau, skipping the main rooms and demanding an audience with Miss Verne's personal valet, a guy thus yet unmentioned by the family. He was in the servants' quarters, in a modest, neat room. He was an old guy named Marcel, with hunched shoulders and a face marked by years of silent service. For more than 40 years, he had worked for Etienne Verne and his father before him. The kindness with which Poirot greeted him was reserved for people whom he considered to be truthful witnesses to tragedy. He said, Monsieur Marcel, pardon our interruption. To comprehend your master's last hours, we need your assistance. Describe his habits to us. What did he do the hour before he sat down to dinner with the family? The elderly man's hands shook. A little. Monsieur, always the same. It hasn't changed in 20 years. He would leave his job at the estate office at 6 o'clock and head to his private study. I would bring him his glass of brandy at exactly 6 o'clock after he finished reading the evening newspaper. Poirot's eyes became more acute the night before he passed away. Was this a different routine? Not at all, Marcel answered regretfully. Monsieur. As usual, I brought his glass and the decanter. He poured it himself. I let him be on his own. The valet hesitated, his forehead creased with memory. But when I returned at 7 to notify him that supper was delayed, he was changed. He clutched his stomach and turned pale. The room was warm, but he blamed me for allowing the fire to go out. He claimed to have a fire burning within of him. My heart pounded. And this was prior to him eating the almond cake and going down to dinner. Oui, monsieur, Marcel said, at least an hour before. He opened a bottle of wine during lunch and blamed it. He was a man who never admitted weakness, so he waved me away. Poirot spoke softly yet firmly as he leaned forward. Marcel, the decanter, the brandy. Who was able to obtain it? During the day, who could access the study? Claudine, Monsieur, the housekeeper, and several more took over the cleaning. Monsieur Shah sometimes delivers paperwork for signature. Madame Elodie hardly came in. The master favoured having his study all to himself. He paused. However, Mademoiselle Marie was frequently in and out. Why? Poirot inquired. She would make sure everything was done to her satisfaction by looking at the books on the shelves. She claimed that as I grew older, my eyes began to miss things. Of all the rooms, the study was the one she was most picky about. If she was present when I arrived, she would occasionally pour the master's brandy herself, stating that she wanted to help her brother. A thick hush descended upon the tiny space. The opportunity, the method, the very moment the poison was administered, we had found it. Poirot nodded slowly and thoughtfully. After expressing gratitude to the distraught valet for his time, we left, followed by Inspector Duval, who had been listening from the doorway with increasing surprise. Poirot guided us straight to Etienne Ven's study without saying a word. The room was dark and masculine, with a big oak desk and the smell of old paper and leather. There was a half-full crystal decanter of brandy and one empty glass on a tiny side table. Poirot took up the glass and examined it in the grey window light. Though he remained silent, it was obvious what he meant. For his part, Duval gazed at the decanter with a mask of emerging understanding on his face. His firmly constructed case against the wife had just fallen apart. I murmured that the cake was a lie. "Worse, Hastings," Poirot said, carefully resetting the glass on the table. It was a lie disguised as a truth. All eyes were on the unloving wife who stood to inherit a wealth. The bitter sister stood silently in the shadows, carrying out a basic daily act of service, but no one dared to glance at her. The Confession, Chapter 6. Once a space of regal pride and refined ceremonial, the Château Vérité's vast salon has assumed the oppressive silence of a courtroom. Long shadows were cast against the panelled walls by the fire, which crackled with a frantic intensity, while outside the winter dusk clung to the leaded glass like a shroud. Chairs had been placed in a purposeful semicircle in front of the hearth. At Poirot's direction, on the surface it would have appeared to be a polite request to sit and talk, the theatre of revelation in actuality. Inspector Duval stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his face gloomy, next to the window. Hélode sat close to the fire, her hands folded in her lap like a marble effigy, her face calm but pale. Behind her, Henri Charvet loomed, his gaze blank and his mouth hard. From the corner, Dr. Besson observed, his face a mask of grudging expectation. Finally, Mademoiselle Marie Verne sat across from Poirot himself, erect, her mourning dress as exact and uncompromising as her lips. Standing by himself in front of them, Poirot exuded the strange silence that always preceded one of his shows. Before the first note, there was the serenity of a great violinist, electric but quiet. With a soft ripple in his voice, he said, "Mes amis, you question why I've brought you here. You think there might be a big announcement. You're right. I do not, however, make any accusations, not quite yet, it's clarity." He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We have been following the obvious line for days. The inherited wife, the poisoned almond cake, and the rumors of an affair. Yes, Nespa, it's a tasty story, but it's also overly well written. If I may say so, it is a story meant to be believed." Hélode twitched a little, but remained silent. Poirot looked over at Duval. "You paused there after spotting the lover and the wife. Motive, means, and opportunity, but you failed to consider timing, the fundamental element of crime. Like a blade, he let the phrase dangle in the air. You see, long before the cake was served, the poisoning symptoms appeared. The fire blazing inside of him, the discomfort, the impatience. When Etienne Verne got down to dinner, it was already there. It had nothing to do with the cake. The misdirection was the cause." There was a startled silence. Shah then leaned forward. "Then how?" Poirot extended his hand. "If I go back to Sixen on the night of the murder, you'll pardon me." As per his usual practice, Miss Verne retreated to his study at that hour. At 6 o'clock, his valet Marcel gave him a glass of brandy. As was his custom, Etienne poured his own brandy. A crystal decanter glistened in the firelight on the side table, and Poirot walked over to it. With the grace of a priest working with sacrament, he touched it. Unopened since the night of the crime, this particular decanter, it was put to the test earlier today. You ask, what was in it? Strychnine. Not very much, but sufficient. Enough to inflict severe pain. Sufficient to cause death. Hélode let out a loud gasp. Charvit's hand held onto the rear of her seat. Slowly, Poirot turned to face Marie. "Madame, he replied quietly. Frequently you were in your brother's study. This is what Marcel tells us. You made sure everything was kept neat and organized. You provided your assistance and critiqued his work. You poured Etienne's brandy yourself on multiple occasions. She squinted. I was helping out around the house. I also own the chateau. Poirot took a step forward. The sadness lies in that, doesn't it? Before your brother abandoned everything, it was all yours. Every vineyard, every stone, every franc to the stranger in black, the outsider, the woman you hated. Marie's tiny leather-gloved hands coiled tightly around her chair's arms. You saw how she took your place, Poirot added in a quiet, personal voice. You witnessed her being trusted, where you were disregarded and accepted when you were rejected. Once the despot you could at least foresee, your brother had shifted his allegiance to someone else. Her cheeks turned red. He betrayed our family, she said. He let her snare everything with her claws. He allowed her to push me away. Poirot's voice was still soft. And so you resolved to punish him, not with spectacle, not with blood, but with something calmer, slower. A death that would appear like luxury, the brandy, the cake, not like murder. A long pause ensued. Then Marie said, her voice. No, Pooh said. Not what the court requires. However, I know the truth. I have your pattern of resentment so expertly concealed beneath politeness, not out of obligation, but out of possession. I have your meticulous supervision of the research, and your unwavering commitment to its order. Marcel's words have been delivered without deceit by me. She occasionally poured the brandy by herself. Poirot's stare was unrelenting now. And, mademoiselle, I have this. The one mistake you couldn't avoid. Before he ever took a piece off of that cake, your brother was already dying. Marie remained silent. Then she burst out laughing, brittle, unpleasant, and brief. It was mine, she muttered. It was all mine before she arrived. When he was younger, he told me. You'll have this one day, Marie. He had second thoughts once she showed there with her quiet power and gentle voice. Her gaze shifted to the burning Elodie. After stealing him from me, you took everything. Elodie said, I never wanted his love. Just peace. Marie faced Poirot once more. I didn't intend for him to pass away. Not in that manner. All I wanted to do was scare him and let him know that I wasn't invisible. Poirot bowed slightly solemnly. However, poison is not a warning phrase. It is a language of finality. Finally, Duval moved forward. His voice regained its authority. For the murder of your brother, Monsieur Etienne Verne, you, Marie Verne, are hereby placed under arrest. With the dignity of a queen reduced low, she climbed slowly. And as she was escorted from the room, her eyes never left Elod. The ensuing quiet was as motionless but resonant with tremors as the air after a storm. Returning his attention to the fire, Poirot used the tip of his shoe to adjust a log. The most persistent poison is bitterness, Hastings, he whispered. It kills slowly until at last it consumes everything. As usual, I gazed at him and marveled at the breadth of his intelligence. Nevertheless, I said quietly, I was on the verge of thinking it was Elodie. Poirot gave a small smile. The best illusions are the ones we want to believe, not the ones we create, mon ami, as you were intended to. He then picked up his cane and hat, and we left the chateau and its ghosts behind as we entered the last of the winter light. Ashes and Vine's epilogue. When the new year arrived, the chateau was silent beneath its heavy slate roof. The sky was pale, and the snow was melting into dark crevices between the vines. The peasants swiftly returned to their daily lives in that archaic, peasant manner, despite the fact that the scandal had reverberated through Dordogne like a stone over calm water. The region was accustomed to death, including violent death. Maybe I thought Madame Elod would sell the estate, leave the chateau, go to Paris, and disappear into civilized obscurity. However, she didn't. Rather, she stayed. Under a tasteful and understated headstone, she laid Etienne to rest in the family plot. She didn't fire any servants. She didn't make any grand declarations. She went around the house's hallways in the days after her sister-in-law's arrest, not like a widow holding on to the past, but rather like a woman getting back to know herself. Poirot received a handwritten letter on quality paper, sealed with black wax a week after the confession. Monsieur Poirot, you once told me that justice takes time and that the truth comes out in pieces, it said. I think you were correct. Now there is silence in the home, as everyone must. The vineyard will eventually awaken from its slumber. As for the rumors that linger in Inspector Duval's notebook, and the servants whispering, I shall say this, and no more. Henri Charvet was my ally, but he was never my lover. We discovered in one another a language of understanding that needed no improper behavior in this house of locked shutters and chilly hallways. Let people believe what they choose to believe. I am still constrained by my own decisions in widowhood, just like in marriage. After reading it once, Ilovero gently folded it and slipped it inside his waistcoat pocket. Elegant, elusive to the last, he whispered. Hastings, what do you think? I believe, I said. She told us precisely what she wanted us to know and left the rest to history. Poirot gave a small smile. Exactly. She then brings the symmetry back. Madame Elod was never seen again. But several months later, a note from Giraud informed us that she had surreptitiously hired new tenants for the lower vineyards, invested in renovating the estate's deteriorating roof, and held a modest fete for the villagers in the early spring. It was reported she wore violet that day, not black, and wandered the terraces alone after nightfall, pausing periodically to gaze across the rows of blooming vines as if awaiting something or someone. However, there was never any mention of Henri Chave walking next to her. He also penciled a last note in Poirot's files under the label Château Vert. Silently, truth ripens like wine. Music. Marie Verne's resentful retaliation is revealed by Hercule Poirot as the chateau's shadows begin to fade. Enraged by a stolen inheritance, her brother Etienne died from poisoned brandy, not the almond cake. Murder at the chateau ends with justice served, but like frost on the vines, echoes of broken loyalty remain. Dear listeners, we hope you have been captivated by this tale of treachery this winter. Did you foresee the sister's quiet rage, or was the wife's poise a lie to you? Comment below. For more suspenseful stories, like and subscribe to Nocturnal Tales if Murder in the Chateau has captured your attention. Joining our membership or leaving a tip through Super Thanks will help us support our craft. The description contains a link